God is going to fulfill prophecy over a 70 to 80 year time frame. There's actually a pattern for this in the Bible, and most people don't know that there's a pattern for it. That's why I'm here. I'm going to tell you the pattern. So there are three what I call generational groups of people. Two of them are in the past. One of them is the future. This is the end time generation, the fig tree generation, the generation that sees all of these things, that sees the fig tree leaf out and all of that. We're a generation, okay? And I believe it's a 70 to 80 year generation since the leafing out of the fig tree. We'll talk about that in a minute. The other two generations aren't really mentioned very much, but they are part of this same prophetic pattern where God is going to fulfill prophecy within a generation of about 70 to 80 years. So the pattern actually started with the Babylonian captivity. The prophet Jeremiah had preached to the people in Judah and Jerusalem. They needed to amend their ways. They needed to serve the Lord. They needed to forsake idolatry and so on. They didn't. And so Nebuchadnezzar came in. He's the Babylonian king. He came in. He exiled the people. He deported people from Jerusalem and brought them into Babylon. But God spoke through Jeremiah that it would only be for 70 years, okay? That the Babylonian captivity would last for 70 years, and then the people would be allowed to go back to their land again. Daniel was one of those people who was taken into captivity. He was exiled, and he realizes, according to what he reads from Jeremiah the prophet, and this is recorded in Daniel chapter 9, Daniel realizes that the 70 years are up, and it's time for the people to go back into the land again. So Daniel has this prayer that he prays, and while he's praying about the 70 years captivity being over and can the people go back, will God let them go back? The angel Gabriel comes to Daniel and says, you're praying about 70 years of captivity. I have a message for you about 70 weeks of years, 70 groups of 7 years. This prophecy, the 70 weeks of years prophecy, I'll be doing a video on this really soon, but this 70 weeks of years prophecy goes from the rebuilding of Jerusalem, the decree to rebuild, up to the time of Christ, and then actually taking it all the way to the end of the 70th week, which is when Christ will return. So this prophecy actually encompasses three very important time periods. The first one is when the people would go back and there would be a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. The second one would be when Messiah comes. The third part of this prophecy is about the end times. And surprise, surprise, the three groups of people who are going to have a 70 to 80 year generation that they see these things are those three groups of people. So the first group are those people who were taken into exile in Babylon. They heard the prophecy that God had given to Jeremiah about they needed to amend their ways or they'd be carried off into captivity. And the people were so certain that because they had God on their side and they had the temple right there in the midst of them, that they were God's favorite people and that no one would ever be able to do anything bad to them. Well, they were wrong. And even though they said the temple, the Nebuchadnezzar came in, took three separate groups of deportees into exile in Babylon, came in, destroyed the city and the temple. It was a mess. But Jeremiah said there would be 70 years and then the people would come back. And God had a witness that he was good to his word. Now, a witness is someone who has firsthand knowledge. That is, they've seen something, they've heard something, they can testify about what they've seen and heard. And what God wants, and one of the things he's looking for with these three groups of 70 to 80 year generational people, he's looking for witnesses, people who can testify that they saw the whole thing from beginning to end. So that first group are the people who heard Jeremiah, who watched the Babylonians come in and take people off to exile. And some of those same people who had been present right there with the first temple that Solomon made and heard Jeremiah maybe and were carried off to Babylon, some of those very same people came back to Jerusalem after the 70 years of exile. There's a very interesting passage that talks about these people. It's in Ezra chapter 3, verses 10 through 13. And the foundation of the temple had been laid and everybody was celebrating. There was a big kind of dedication thing going on. And verse 12 of Ezra 3, but many of the older priests, the Levites and family heads who'd seen the first temple, that is Solomon's temple, which was like big and glorious, wept loudly when they saw the foundation of this temple because it was nowhere near as grand. Still, many others shouted joyfully, and the people could not distinguish between the shouts of joy from the shouts of weeping because the people were making so much noise. So there was a group of people who witnessed everything. They saw the folly of the Jews before the exile. They heard Jeremiah preaching, for people to repent. They saw the Babylonians come in, destroy the temple and the city. They were deported. They were in exile for 70 or so years. They came back. They saw the foundation of the second temple, and they were witnesses to everything that God did. Now, there is a second group of witnesses, and this group of witnesses is also over a 70 to 80 year time period. And this group of people are the contemporaries of Jesus. So in the prophecy in Daniel 9, we have the going forth of a decree to rebuild and restore Jerusalem. Until Messiah, the Prince, there's going to be a certain amount of years. And I'm going to be doing a follow-up video on the 70 weeks of Daniel prophecy. And I think that's the next video I'll do after this one. So from the decree, now we have Messiah the Prince. Okay, so that's Jesus. So when Messiah the Prince comes, there is another generational period of about 70 to 80 years. So you may ask, well, what do you mean, Brenda? Before Christ was born, there was a star that appeared. Some wise men came. They brought their whole entourage into Jerusalem and scared Herod half to death. Who are these people? They've come to see the King of the Jews. Who's the King of the Jews? Where is he going to be born? They knew he was going to be born in Bethlehem because there were so many Old Testament prophecies concerning the Messiah, when he would come, where he'd be born, the things that he would do. The problem with Jesus, though, as time went on, was that he didn't match the picture that these people had in their minds about this Messiah who would sit on David's throne. They saw Jesus. He's hanging out with tax collectors and sinners. He's healing the sick. He's raising the dead. And he's also raising a big ruckus, contradicting the scribes and the Pharisees and the chief priests and so on. And even though Jesus healed in their streets and preached in their streets, raised the dead, did all kinds of things, the Jewish leaders of Jesus' day did not have the spiritual eyes to see who Jesus was, that he was indeed the prophesied Messiah who was to come. So Jesus said about this generation, he called them a brood of vipers and snakes, and he said how God had sent prophets and preachers and teachers, and some of them you crucified and some you flogged in your synagogues and you persecuted them from town to town. And he says that the blood of all those innocent people who had come before would be required of that generation. So there is a generation here. And the generation of Jesus' day was a fig tree generation. But there are two fig tree generations. The fig tree generation of Jesus' day was the cursed fig tree. The fig tree in the parable in Luke chapter 13 verses 6 through 9, Jesus told a story about a man who had a fig tree in his vineyard and he kept looking for fruit. For 3 years he looked for fruit on that tree and there wasn't any. And he told the guy there, he said, just cut it down. And the man who took care of the fig tree says, well, let me fertilize it and do a few things and see if we can't get it to bear fruit. And if you come back next year and there's nothing here, we'll cut it down. Okay, notice Jesus never said in this parable that the fig tree would be destroyed, burnt down, annihilated. He said it would be cut down. And the fig tree was this nation of Israel. Okay, and there's another story about the fig tree. Jesus went up to a fig tree and he looked for fruit on it. And this is just before he was about to be crucified, just before Holy Week and all of that. He's looking for fruit on this fig tree. He didn't see any, and he cursed the fig tree. Now, Jesus also spoke out against the generation of people of that day. Their house would be left desolate, that's their temple, that there wouldn't be one stone left standing on another that wouldn't be cast down. And this was actually a prophecy that's in Daniel 9, where Daniel says, then after the 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing. That's talking about Jesus dying. And then the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. And that's exactly what happened when the Romans came in under Titus in 70 AD. Now, if we put the birth of Christ, maybe around 4 BC, thereabouts, there's about 70 to 80 years between the time Christ arrived, between his birth, the Star of Bethlehem, the wise men, miracles, healings, preaching, teaching, all of that until the temple was destroyed was about 70 years. There were people who saw it all. Okay, there were people who were witnesses to all of this stuff, whose parents said, hey, there's a little star, there's a new star out there, come outside, Jeremiah, look at this little star up there. And little kids coming out looking at the star, hearing about all the babies who died in Bethlehem, the excitement that came when John the Baptist showed up, healings, miracles, and so on. And then a crucifixion. This man who'd done all this stuff was crucified. And then there's rumors that he rose from the dead, and now his apostles are doing all the same things that Jesus did. And within 40 years of the time Jesus died, in AD 70, the Romans would come in and destroy the city and the sanctuary, just like Daniel and Jesus prophesied. There was a 70 to 80 year generation of people who were there at the first coming of Christ. Okay? And again, we're talking about the city of Jerusalem. We're talking about the destruction of the temple. We're talking about exiles and dispersion, kind of the same themes that we were talking about with the Babylonians when Nebuchadnezzar came into Jerusalem and brought the Jews into exile, destroyed the temple, and so on. So in the Olivet discourse in Matthew 24, the disciples are asking Jesus, so, you just rode in on the donkey. Okay, basically, Jesus had already done his triumphal entry. And so the disciples are going, well, so when are you going to do the whole set up the kingdom thing? When is your coming, your parousia? And Jesus said, well, it's kind of like this. And he talked about there's going to be wars and rumors of wars, and people are going to persecute believers. And then there's going to be something that you will see, the abomination of desolation. And when people see that, they need to flee they need to run. And Jesus wasn't talking about people living during that day. He's talking about the time period that would precede him setting up the kingdom. That's what the disciples were asking about. They weren't asking about his second coming or anything like that because they didn't even know he was going to die. That didn't go through their head at this point in time. So they're asking Jesus, so what are the signs of your coming and the end of the age, and basically the beginning of the age of the kingdom, the millennial reign? So Jesus talks about all these bad things that are going to happen. Then in chapter 24, Jesus says this, learn the lesson from the fig tree. Okay, so the disciples, they understood there was a parable about a fig tree that for over 3 years was not producing fruit. They understood when Jesus railed on the scribes and Pharisees. They understood when Jesus cursed the fig tree that something symbolic had happened. And then when Jesus said that all of this was going to be taken down, that the Daniel prophecies were going to be fulfilled, including the abomination prophecy that's found in Daniel, as well as the Messiah being cut off and the city and the sanctuary being destroyed by an army and its prince. When Jesus says this about the fig tree, As soon as its branches become tender and sprout leaves, you know that summer is near. Now, here's the thing about a tree. I have a small orchard. It's not very happy most of the time because I'm not a very good orchardman. But if you cut down a tree that's not producing, we have some apple trees and my husband cut them down. Well, at first it looks like there's nothing going on, but if you haven't killed the tree, if the tree is not totally dead, after a couple of years or so, it's going to send up suckers and sprouts, and that tree is kind of going to come back again. Even though the fig tree is cursed, and even though the tree needs to be cut down because it's not producing fruit, just because you cut the tree down doesn't mean it no longer exists. So there's a pattern of 70-year prophecy here. And if this 70-year pattern that was in Babylon, that again showed up with the life of Christ, it's most likely going to happen all over again with the nation of Israel during the end times. And remember, even though Israel was dispersed throughout the nations, in order for the prophecies about the abomination of desolation to take place and the second coming of Christ to happen after that, you actually have to have Israel regathered again, and you have to have a temple again, or some kind of temple again. Israel has to come back again. Jerusalem has to be in existence. There has to be these people of God, of Israel, in order for the end time stuff to happen. So Ezekiel 37 tells us how these dry bones that have been scattered among the graveyard of nations are going to be brought back together. They don't have a spirit yet, okay, but they're brought back together, and these bones are going to live. This is the regathering of Israel. This is the fig tree that when you see it have leaves, you know that summer is near and that he is at the gates. So the people who see all this happening are also going to see the return of Christ. Now, here's the thing, especially in our day and age, it's easy to forget. It's easy for history to go down the memory hole. A while back, a few months ago, I was talking to a younger person, someone in their 20s, about end time stuff. And I said, yeah, the nation of Israel being back in their land again is a fulfillment of prophecy. And they said, well, hasn't Israel always been Israel? I was like, okay, this is how it happens. That stuff doesn't get passed from one generation. And so the information from the previous generation just goes away or even gets stuffed down the memory hole, where the current generation does not understand that prophecy has been fulfilled. This is why prophecy is fulfilled within living memory, so that the people that saw the first part of it live to see the whole thing. And they can testify that God keeps his promises, that prophecy is true, and that God is going to do what he says he's going to do. Is there a confirmation that the 70-year prophecy might be a thing? Okay, that Israel being around, the fig tree coming back and leafing out, might actually be a reality. Okay, that it's not just something we're making up. Well, I think there was a confirmation for the whole idea of a 70 to 80-year window of a generation who's going to see things from beginning to end, just like in Babylon, just like in the time of Christ. And the confirmation, I believe, was the Revelation 12 sign. And I just did a video on that, a little refresher video on the Revelation 12 sign a few days ago. I'll leave a link to that in the description box. This particular astronomical alignment took place on September 21st through 23rd of 2017. And it was the fulfillment of what is symbolically described in Revelation 12 verses 1 and 2. It's called the Great Sign, or the Sign of the Woman. And this alignment took place on the 70th anniversary of Israel becoming a nation. So if you take 1947, you add 70 years, you're going to get to 2017. Now, a lot of people say, well, Israel didn't become a nation until 1948. Okay, so if you're Israel, your year starts in the fall. Okay, so in the fall of 1947, in November actually, the United Nations passed a resolution which allowed for the creation of the nation state of Israel. And 5 or 6 months later, in May of 1948, which is actually still the same year, it's all the same year, the Hebrew year runs from 1947 to 48, to the fall of 48. Okay, that's when Israel declared their statehood. So that alignment and Israel's 70th anniversary of being a state occurred simultaneously, and the Revelation 12 sign happened on the very beginning of the Jewish year on the Feast of Trumpets. So to me, this is a confirmation that we're looking at the beginning of a time period that actually puts us in the book of Revelation, because we saw the Revelation 12 sign. If you saw it, you're now a witness to it, and you get to be part of the group. Okay, now I'm not old enough to have seen the regathering of Israel, but I've heard people talk about it. I know people who were alive at that time, even though there are people who want to take the Holocaust and throw that down the memory hole. That still is in present day memory. So from 2017, we have another about 10 years, bringing us to 2027 for all of these things that Jesus talked about in Matthew 24 to be fulfilled. And what that means, all of these things will happen, and then Jesus will set up his kingdom. So for me, the sign was a confirmation that the fig tree was back, and that it had been here for about 70 years. And there are about 10 years from 2017 to 2027 to fulfill that 80 year. That Psalm 90 verse 10 talks about a generation living between 70 and 80 years. So I believe that we are that generation that is going to see all these things. And I think that we are witnesses to what God is doing in his prophetic plan. In the next video, Lord willing, I'm going to talk about the 70-week prophecy in Daniel chapter 9. This is an extremely important prophecy, and most people get it wrong. Okay, I'm just telling you, most people get it wrong. So I hope you'll stick around for that video. It'll be one of my more important videos. And because we're really bumping up against a timeline here, for the second coming, including when are we going to be raptured, all of that, we really need to have Daniel's 70 weeks nailed down in our own minds. We need to understand what Daniel was really prophesying, what the prophecy really means, and how to apply it both in the first century when Jesus lived and also in our time, because the prophecy actually extends all the way to the people who are in that last group of generational witnesses. All right, so I hope you've enjoyed this video. Leave a comment. I hope you'll share it. Get the show notes. The link for those are in the description box, and we'll see you on another video. Till then, have a blessed day.